The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host, and today I'm with Dr. Scott Taylor, who I think of as a new friend, where we travel in a lot of the same circles, especially through the International Association for Near-Death Studies.
Yep.
That conference happens every year. It moves around the U.S. It's international, but has it ever been outside the U.S.?
That's a good question. And I would say I think there was one in Canada,
Okay. Well,
a zillion years ago, but it's
well,
mostly
only a
moved
few months
around to,
ago in late August, it was in Phoenix, and I live in Tucson, so I was able to just take a short drive, and we're probably between, I don't know, 750 to maybe 800 people present in a resort hotel. And Scott was one of the MCs of the whole 4-day event. Easy to spot because he's very proud of his Scottish roots, and he was in a kilt all the while. And just very engaging. It was clear that they picked a good person for that role because you just looked like you knew everybody in the place and put all of us at ease. So
well,
one of the things I enjoy, I think you're muted. Did you just say something?
no, I,
Oh, that's why
I
I think.
wouldn't think of interrupting you.
I hope you will, or I'll talk the whole time. Um, uh, anyway, we were together at that conference, and you since invited me to be on your podcast about a month ago, and so I decided to reciprocate and introduce you to my audience. So. I don't know how you formally going about introducing you, but one of the things in the materials that I was looking at is you're president of the Expanded Awareness Institute. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And
Yes,
did you found that?
I did about 30 years ago. It was a long time.
Okay. But you have a lot of other accolades and so on. You have an MBA from Northwestern and a Doctor of Education in the University of St. Thomas. That's in the Twin Cities, isn't it?
It
Minnesota.
is, yeah. Headquartered St. Paul. Yep.
Yeah. And then are you still executive director of the Monroe Institute, or is that something that's part of your recent past?
That's part of my past. Yes,
Yeah.
I retired from there, and now I am a full-time podcaster, and I teach on the Shift Network. And when I can, I volunteer for IANS.
Uh-huh. Well, you've got a very full life. So I'm looking forward to just getting to know you better by virtue of doing this podcast. My podcast is only in its third year, and I really didn't even listen to podcasts before I had one, where I hosted them. But one of the delights of it has been that people at least in the near-death experience world and uh, a lot of related uh, disciplines, I just find such generous, kind people. And if you ask them to be on your show, they say yes in an instant, as you did. So I'm hoping to get to know you better in the course of this and introduce you to a lot of people that don't know about you. So fire away, Scott. Tell us what you'd like to talk about today.
First off, thank you for the invitation. I have been looking forward to our conversation, and um, we're off to a great start. I think maybe what I'll do is just talk about my experience because I think it will lend some perspective for your listeners on how I came to this. So technically, I had what is known as a shared death experience. I didn't know that at the time. I didn't have words for it at the time. I grew up in southern Minnesota. My background is a very traditional Presbyterian Protestant kind of approach to Christianity, and this world of spirituality just wasn't on the radar. I was just doing your standard grow up Midwestern small town kind of guy. Well, in 1981, I was in love with a woman. Her name was Mary Frances Randall. And she and her son Nolan had been out sailing on Lake Washington in beautiful southern Minnesota. And on their way home from that day of sailing, they were involved in this horrific car accident. Mary Fran was killed outright, and Nolan, who had just turned 7, had a mortal head injury. They immediately rushed them both to Rochester, Mayo. So they got some of the best health care on the planet,
Mhm.
but it wasn't going to make a difference to what happened to Nolan. It took him 6 days to make his transition from the accident to when he left his body for the last time. And that becomes important because during that 6 days, the families had a chance to converge on St. Mary's Hospital in Rochester. And that that becomes important because Mary Fran was one of 9, and so all of these brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and boyfriends and girlfriends and husbands and wives and friends and parents and grandparents. I mean, the place was just filled with people who were coming to hold vigil for Nolan, who was the eldest grandchild.
Mhm.
So
Was it
that
pretty
meant
clear at the time that he would die?
um, not to me. No, we knew that he was seriously wounded.
Hmm.
He was he was in a coma
Yeah.
from which he would never come out of.
Hmm.
They showed us the X-ray of his head, and it looked like somebody had dropped a watermelon on the ground. You know, it was that kind of fracture pattern
Uh-huh.
that you see, and the doctors, just said this is really serious. There's going to be some severe brain swelling, and we'll see what happens. And so during that intervening 6 days, we had a chance to see what would happen. And as the course of the week went by, it was clear that he wasn't getting any better, and he was kind of maintaining this um, this state of, well, his comatose state.
Hmm.
And there were so many of us that he was in a small hospital room with a zillion, monitors around the backside, around the head of the bed. And there was no way that, I don't know, was there 40, 50 of us that were there in the waiting room that we could fit in that room or should be in that room. So we
Right.
divvied it up. 2 people every 2 hours would go in and be with him. And the nursing staff there was just terrific because they did something I didn't really expect, which was to to tell us um, that it was important that we talk to Nolan, that we read him stories, that we converse with him, even though he couldn't respond, because hearing is the last sense to go.
I
So,
wanted to stop you there for a second. I always
yeah,
thought it was touch that was the last to go. Is there a, I don't know, science to back up that hearing is lasts even more than touch?
that's really interesting.
Don't
I
know.
I don't know that, but that's what we were told.
Okay. So you acted
And
on that.
so, as it turns out, we had um, my shift was from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. on the morning of the 6th day. And Mary Fran's oldest sister, Jannie, the two of us had that shift. And we went in and we had, a favorite storybook, which we read to him. We, oh, Father Nathan, we told him stories about his uncles
Uh-huh.
who, at about midnight, had gone throughout the Mayo health system stealthily and stolen all the cushions off of the couches.
Well,
So and then they brought him back and put him on the floor of the waiting room so that people could lie down and be more comfortable because all the chairs were used up.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you can just picture in your mind this waiting room and people just gathered higgledy piggledy with coats over them. It was quite the collection. So we were telling him these stories, and about 4:45 in the morning, Janny, who was a trained emergency room nurse, went to the end of the bed, looked at his charts, looked at the monitors, and she just shook her head and held out her hand to me and said, "Scott, it's time to say goodbye." And so the two of us pulled up chairs next to his head, and we told him that we were so proud of him, that he had fought so hard to stay with us in the physical world, but that if his mother should come to pick him up, remembering that she died 6 days before at the scene of the accident, but that if Mary Fran should come and come for him and pick him up, and ask him to go with her, that that would be the right thing to do. And we affirmed our love for him and that he would always be in our hearts. And then our 15 minutes was up. The next crew was coming in, and we left. Well, it wasn't more than 45 minutes later that um, the nurse on duty came into the waiting room, flipped on the lights, and told us all that it was time, that his vital signs were moving down rather markedly. So we all filed into this little hospital room, and for
So
whatever reason,
how many are in there by now? It's what, like 5 o'clock in the morning or so?
yeah, it's about 5:45 in the morning
Uh,
ish,
yeah.
and it's
I don't know, 10 or
there
20
were
in
four.
the
It
room.
was four deep around the bed
All right. A big
by the
group.
time I got into the room.
Yeah.
So call it 50 people, 40 people. It was a lot.
Yeah.
And, I walk in, see the situation, and I went, well, that's just silly. I'm not going to be the fifth row. So I went over and sat on the windowsill next to Mary Fran's youngest brother, Willie, and we just waited. And, there's not a lot to do
Yeah.
as you're sitting or standing. You're just really just watching the heart monitor, do where it does the bumpy thing, and it got slower and slower, and the bumps got less and less, and then finally he flatlined. And when he flatlined, what I experienced was Mary Fran coming across the veil and scooping her son up out of his physical body.
You experienced that. Did it seem more visual than anything else?
No, it was not visual. It this is where, when people say that shared death or near death experiences are ineffable, this is one of those. It was, um, in my mind's eye, it was the this energy that came into the room that had Mary Fran's signature to it.
Mhm. Okay.
I mean, I knew who it was. I mean, there wasn't any question in my mind that it was Mary Fran, but it wasn't like she was in a physical body, like,
Yes. Or
like
something
Casper the
does
Ghost or something.
microspectral that was visionary.
Yep. So she she comes in, she crosses the veil and scoops Nolan up out of his physical body. And the two of them had this exquisite reunion, as you could only imagine, between a mother and her son.
Hmm.
And it surprised me because I was able to participate in that. I felt what they were feeling, and it was just a joyous reunion between the two of them. But then what surprised me even more was that they then turned to me, came over, embraced me, and then the three of us left and went into the light. And when we entered into the light, it was this exquisite place. It's just filled with the love of the universe. It was as if I was one with everything and I
Mhm.
was still me. I, um, it
Let me
was,
pause right there. You said we went into which suggests motion, traveling from point to point. Did it feel like that? Sometimes
no,
NDErs talk about going through a tunnel. Um, did it feel like motion?
no, it
No.
didn't. I use that because it helps explain it.
Right.
But as long as you ask, so I'm sitting there on the windowsill and it's like I'm still in the windowsill, but I have moved. I have entered into another dimension
Right.
that is um, extraordinary. It's
Yes.
this dimension of love. It's um, people talk about that place where near death experiences where people go. It's right here.
Yes.
It exists in the same space as we do in the physical world of duality, but it's it's different. It exists on a different vibratory level and it has different rules to it. We
Yeah.
can talk about that later, but it's the unity universe where you are just connected with everything.
Right. And
And
because I'm a Catholic priest and a Christian and a person with my own set of mystical phenomena that's gone on for a long time, that's really important to me because oftentimes people, with regard to God, for example, or prayer, can assume that the one they're speaking to in a prayer is in a different place, and the prayer sometimes somehow needs to travel from point to point, uh, like an email or a phone call or something. And I try to teach. That's one way to think about it, but it doesn't have to be the only way. You could already be there. If God is already inside you, your prayer doesn't need to go anywhere. It can just happen within you. Anyway,
that's my experience um, is that loving consciousness that is the universe, that is God, is is everywhere present. And in particular for me, it was right there. It was immediate. It
yeah,
was
okay, that's a
um,
good point. I'm glad we emphasize that.
and so to your other point, which is, was it visual? Um, and yes, it was visual, but it wasn't visual like we think of it, where there's a person with a body and two arms, and this was a space that was energized by the presence of Mary Fran and of Nolan.
Yes,
And and I'll often tell people that thank God it didn't happen in English. That it's when we speak using words, words put boundaries on concepts.
yes,
And that space isn't like that. And that when Mary Fran says that she loved me, that has so many more meanings than just, a personality of affection for each other. It embodies all of our past experiences and the future experiences and what isn't going to happen. And it talks about, the care and concern that I have for her family and her son. I mean, all of it is embodied in the thought of, you know, Scott, I love and care for you. It's it's so much bigger than words can allow.
you had
And
endured her death 6 days earlier, right? Is that correct?
yeah, she died 6 days before.
Right. And had you had any sense of her presence in the intervening time?
No,
Okay.
I really didn't. Um, I didn't when she passed. I was at work,
Yes.
and and it didn't enter in there. Um, no, her presence really became known to me when she came to pick up Nolan, and then the
Mhm.
two of them turned, embraced me, and then we went to the light. That was really my first full blown experience of her consciousness and mine being able to communicate.
Had you interested in this kind of topic before this all happened?
Not a whit.
No.
No,
So
I really
you hadn't sought it out or anything. You were just living your life, and then this all occurred.
no. I'm a traditional Presbyterian mainline. We don't talk about this stuff. I mean, it's just not part of the lexicon of the Presbyterian Church. Just isn't. And at that point in my life, I'm in my late 20s, and I'm an executive in a retail firm, and I'm trying to you know s- start my professional life, and it just wasn't part of my radar.
Right.
I wasn't. No, I didn't have any clue.
Mhm.
So picking up the story, um, they embraced me. We went to the light, and I was immersed in this extraordinarily loving, compassionate field. But that really wasn't what was important. What was important is that the three of us were there, and we had a chance to affirm our love and affection for each other. We had a chance to say a proper goodbye, um, because I wasn't there at the scene of the accident. And then we had a chance just to be with one another for a while.
Mhm.
And then at some point, it was complete. It wasn't like, "Hey, Father Nathan, see you later."
Mhm.
It was more like, this is what we needed to do now, and it's time for both of us to do what we need to do. Which for them, they turned and went further into the light, and I came back to my physical body, which was sitting on the windowsill next to Brother Willie.
Mhm.
So that's part A of the story. There's three parts to it. Um, so I'm pausing for just a second in case you got something else.
Well, um, there were perhaps 40 to 50 other people in the room. As far as you know, you're the only one that experienced the things you've just described.
That's part C of the story.
So I'm getting ahead of you then. Okay.
So part B goes to this rather strange thing which happened to me. So I'm sitting on this windowsill, and I am in the light with Mary, Fran, and Nolan. And it's like 100% of my consciousness is with them in that space, and the communications that we're having telepathically with one another. And 100% of my consciousness was there sitting on the windowsill next to Willie.
Mhm.
And it's strange to call it like that, because it wasn't like a 50-50 split. My consciousness was here and my consciousness was there. No, it was like I was all there and I was all in the room. Um, I didn't have a word for it then. I do now. I call it bilocation. But it was it was quite clear. I'm sitting on this windowsill, and it was like the love of the universe was inside my physical body, and it was trying to burst out of me.
Yes.
It was this extraordinary feeling, and it showed on my face, because I was sitting there and I'm grinning because I'm being loved like I've never been loved before. And I am in such a place of joy and ecstasy that if anybody else in the room had looked at me right then,
Mhm.
they would have misunderstood. Because, I mean, Mary
Yes,
Fran just
died.
died 6 days before, and Nolan had just passed, and I'm got this an expression that was a mismatch for the room. So I did the only thing I could think of, which was to cover my face with my hands and just be in that space until that part of me that was with Mary Fran and Nolan was done. And, that part could come back and we reconnect and I can be, all there in the room and I could bring my hands down and be with, the other grieving relatives that are in the room
Yes.
and, do what you do in that situation. You hug each other and you cry on each other's shoulder. And it was extremely sad. And and it was really confusing because this was so outside of my experience, outside of my um, even my ability to comprehend what had happened to me that I didn't know what to do with it. So truly, I just didn't speak of it for 15 years.
Oh,
Just it just made no sense to me. So that's part B. You ready for part C,
I'm
which goes
all ears. Let's do part C.
which goes right to your question. So at some point in my life, I I know that I would like to be with Mary Fran and Nolan again. And having been in that space with them once, I was absolutely convinced that if I did it once, I could do it again. I just had to figure out how. And I did all kinds of things. I traveled to ancient sites and I practiced different traditions and eventually I found a meditation technique that was taught to be by the Monroe Institute that allowed me to enter into that space and I could reconnect with Mary, Fran, and Nolan. So when that happened, I was in this process of searching and I had gone to seminary, I got my degree, um, but it wasn't really working. And so I thought maybe I could approach it a little more academically. So I signed up for a doctoral program at the University of St. Thomas, which is another great story, but not
Before
right
you
now.
skip over seminary, what degree did you get in a seminary?
It was a degree in spiritual counseling,
I see.
and it was from the New Seminary in New York City. And that seminary, the faculty, it's an interfaith seminary. So the
Uh-huh.
faculty are Catholic priests and Muslim sheikhs and ministers. And one of
Right.
my favorite professors was a voodoo practitioner from Cuba.
Uh,
I just, it was, it was appropriate for me at that time in my life.
mhm.
Um, so where was I? Oh,
You were
um,
going on to St. Thomas, I think.
so I'm at St. Thomas and I decide that I'm going to write my dissertation on near-death experiences. And I had to find people to interview. And believe it or not, I started down the wrong road. I thought maybe if I went to hospices or hospitals that they could tune me into people who had spiritually transformative experiences of one
Mhm.
flavor or another. But HIPAA laws got in the way.
Uh, did you ever talk
And
to Raymond Moody about it?
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yep. And so what I did instead, one of the interim steps was I sent letters to all of Mary Fran's sisters because they all wound up in healthcare in one form or another. I figured, well, I'll go around the system. Maybe they have some way for me to access folks who've had near death experiences that I could interview. Well,
Mhm.
one of them wrote me back and said, Scott, some years after Mary Fran passed away, I had a near death experience and I'd love to tell you about it. So we met and I, being a good academician, I recorded the whole thing. And when it was over, I'm putting away my stuff, and I have this thought comes into my head, which is I'm going to call her the sister because she chooses to remain anonymous. But the sister asked me, or I mean, excuse me, I asked the sister, say, when Nolan left his body for the last time, something really unusual happened to me in that hospital room. And I'm just kind of curious if anything unusual happened to you too. And I'm looking at her, and her eyes just get as big as saucers.
Hmm.
Taking that as a yes, I unpack my gear, turn the recorder back on, and say, I tell you what, why don't you tell me your experience, and then I'll tell you mine, and we'll compare notes. This is what she told me. She said, Scott, I remember it really well because I was standing bedside. I happened to be standing on the other side of the bed, and I could see you sitting on the windowsill with Willie. I said, Yep, that's right. And she said, Well, when Nolan flatlined, what I experienced was I, meaning the sister.
Yes.
She said, What I experienced was Mary Fran coming across the veil, scooping Nolan up out of his physical body. They had this exquisite reunion. And then at some point, the two of them turned to me, embraced me, and the three of us went to the light
Okay. So
where
she
we had
saw
a
that.
chance to affirm our love and affection for each other. We had a chance to say goodbye and hang out for a little bit. And then eventually they went into the light and I came back to my physical body. It was almost identical words that I had, described to myself. There is no way that she could have thought or known about what I had said because I hadn't told anybody.
Yes.
It so it's one of those rare events of a shared death experience
Yeah. Yeah.
where the two of us had identical experiences at the same time. We just didn't see each other when we were in that space. And
Right.
besides, time is kind of a funky thing in that space anyway.
Yes.
Um, so in that moment, if I had any doubts about what had happened to me, they completely disappeared. And the same happened for her too. She, was outside of her experience. And in an instant, it was this affirmation that this really did happen. It really was um, an event where we transcended time and space and entered into this loving consciousness that we could be a part of, that we neither one of us knew even was there. So that's it, Father Nathan.
All right. You mentioned, well, thank you for all that. Before I go any further, you mentioned I didn't have the language to describe it at the time, but later I landed on bilocation. Uh, did you know of bilocation in the Christian tradition before that?
Nope, I didn't.
Did
And
you learn
I,
about
I
it?
know that happens in now having read in the Catholic tradition. There are a number of saints who did this and
Yeah.
flew in planes, and I mean, all kinds of really wonderful stories.
A lot of my audience is Roman Catholic, and not all of it, of course, but for those that pay attention to such things, most people think of Padre Pio,
Yep.
who has only he only died maybe in the 80s, I think, maybe the mid 80s. I'm not sure, but he was a little like Mother Teresa in that but both of them were considered sort of living saints before they left here. And
I, the stories around him and World War II are really quite compelling.
yes,
So I'm yes, and in this case, it was um, they were energetic presences more than his were corporeal, where they could live and touch and hug and really
Yes.
feel.
Hmm.
Um, and it was, yeah. It so Mary Fran and her whole family were Catholic and are Catholic,
Hmm.
and that but that kind of that degree of spirituality hadn't wasn't part of their mindset either, other than they'd been exposed to it during their um, learning about that tradition.
Yeah, that's true for a lot of, it's funny because my second spiritual language is Presbyterian. I went to Presbyterian College, Trinity in San Antonio, and many of my
Oh,
closest friends were in the Presbyterian ministry, and then the seminary that I studied at, Graduate Theological in Berkeley, included a Presbyterian seminary in the cluster. So,
yes, it does. Yeah.
but from its beginning, it was kind of hyper rational because of the Enlightenment, and some of the reform was against priests being in charge of things, and kind of the mystical part of the faith was part of what was set aside in order to focus more on what Calvin and others in that tradition were trying to do. Um, anyway,
Yep, it's true. And ho- hopefully the Presbyterians have mellowed since then. I
I watched some of it. I was even in the middle of it. There were Presbyterians, including Presbyterian ministers, that would talk to me about how to incorporate bits of this without becoming too Catholic. You know, there are always these things to be concerned about.
so my office mate, guy by the name of Rich Bauman, he in fact he just passed last week.
Uh,
Um, I was a small business management instructor for the state of Minnesota, which meant I mentored small businesses. And Rich, my office mate, he did the same thing, only he specialized in dairy farms. And he's a real salt of the earth guy. And his wife had unexpectedly no anticipation of this, whatever. I mean, Rich woke up one day and Barb was gone. She was just lying there next to him in bed and nobody home. And they'd been married for 52 years and he was just distraught.
mhm,
Fast forward about 6 months. He gets up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and he's walking down the hall. And there in the hallway is Barb, dressed in his favorite red sweater. He sees her and says, Barb, I've just had this terrible dream that you had died and you had left me. And she says to him, Rich, I did die. And they sent me down here to tell you that I'm okay and that you're going to be okay too. And at that point, they had been walking towards each other, and he reached out and embraced her. And he said, she was corporeal. It was Barb, and he could hug her, and she was hugging him back, and he
yeah.
could he could feel the sweater. He could, the hair on the side of her face. And they stood there in the hallway, embraced each other, and then she dissolved.
Hmm.
And it it he is such an salt of the earth, honest guy that I don't even think he could make this up. I mean, he was a Methodist, so
Oh my God.
you know, so it would talk about not in the solution set, um, but it's one of those events, as he was describing it to me, that also takes and um, just shifts my thinking, specifically around when Jesus came back to the apostles after the crucifixion. And he's standing there and he's got the wounds and he tells Thomas to
Go
to
ahead.
poke the wounds, and they do. And he's corporeal.
Yes. Do you remember that one story in John's Gospel where he says, "You got some anything here to eat?" And he eats in front of them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, and so but it's something that I had when, growing up, I said, oh, well, that's an interesting metaphorical story until Rich told me his story.
Yes.
And you go, that really happened. And it happened to a really ordinary guy. And Barb, as lovely as she was, I don't think of her as, like a saint or something. She came back to comfort him and to tell him that she's okay and he's okay. So Barb's telling me, I'm sorry, Rich is telling me this story. And when he gets all done, I look at him and go, Rich, who was they? You know, Barb had said, they sent me here to tell you.
Right.
Who's they? And I have to remember that his look of complete astonishment that I would even ask that question, that he said, Scott, she's standing there in the hallway. She's real. I'm not thinking about who they is. I'm just so happy to
Yeah.
see her and to talk to her. So I have to remember to get my priorities straight.
Sure. It was in the middle of the night too. He had just been asleep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, part of the reason I had all these experiences that I relate in the work that I do in the books that I've written, but I didn't tell them until I was 60 years old. I mean, not out loud in public. I did privately to people I trusted. But in the Christian tradition, are you familiar with the phrase the Easter proclamation?
Yeah.
It just means he is risen or Jesus is risen from the dead. It's the gospel message in a sentence. And it's not just about Jesus being this one in a million odd creature that survived his death. He's saying, I'm the template. I'm
Yeah. Well,
you're like
yeah.
me.
In John, Paul talks about, um, you know, what I can do, you can do, and more.
Yes, exactly.
There's a paraphrase, but it's something like that that just says, "Hey, I I can do this, you can do it, and there's probably more stuff that I didn't have time to do, so,
Yes,
have at it."
exactly. Yeah.
That's a bit colloquial, but we'll go with it.
Well, um, it's so important that people tell their stories in their own language, like your friend saying, "Well, the sweater was tactile." 'Cause I was asking you, was the experience that you had visual, and you said not exactly. It wasn't of the senses. It wasn't visual, but sometimes it is. Everybody has a different experience to share, and then one of the ways, like when I deal with the souls, I get a dream, I write it down, I get with prayer partners, we talk with the angels and saints and ask them to come and surround us. They're already there anyway, but bringing yourself into the awareness that they're there, making the space safe.
Yep.
Uh, I very often have gotten to the point where I almost ask the guardian angels to come on first just to give a little clarity because dreams have an indistinctness by their nature. They can have symbology or different things. So I often ask for a little clarity, and then sometimes someone other than the guardian comes on first, and I'll know who it is. It was Mother Mary in a recent one, and I'll know who it is, but not because I saw a picture or necessarily heard a voice. It's knowing. And the thing, how when you're at the airport trying to greet someone and there's a big crowd and people are going and coming and go, but you're looking, you're trying to spot the person that you are there to greet. And then when you do, you know how our eyes see things upside down? And then somewhere between the eyeball, the optic nerve, and the
Yep.
brain flips the image, and then it's still raw data. It's still just pixels or something, but then it touches some point of knowing. There's some place inside us that goes, it's Joe. That data has to move from being just information to knowing. And oftentimes when someone moves toward me or into me, I'll know who it is, but I don't know it because I saw, tasted, smelled, touched. Yeah, I just know. Yeah.
Yes. And in all of the years since then, I've done a lot of work, a lot of meditation to develop that sense of knowingness.
Yeah.
And it's really reliable
Yeah.
because, um, you know, we call it an energy signature. It just,
Yes.
when it moves into you, you go, oh, yeah, that's Mary Fran. That's Nolan.
Right.
That's my old teacher. That's my grandpa Brett. They are so distinctly different
Yeah.
that there's there's just no way you could confuse them, but you have to be open to the possibility and to be able to trust that that's what is coming to you because you're right. It's not like, they're like at the airport. They're not sitting there holding a little sign that says, "Hi, I'm your grandma Ginny." It just that isn't how it works.
Well, sometimes when I've been in the work that my prayer partners and I do, the guardian angels, of course, are brilliant and experienced and so on. But the one they're guarding is just some guy that died in a car crash, just
Yeah.
just just some person who wasn't paying any attention to all this kind of spirit stuff, but who left the body. And that they've told me sometimes uh, that in order for them to move into me, they had to watch the oscillation of my own energy and then match it.
And match it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And get on the same wavelength as me. And they said it's not hard to do. You just have to be patient and watch for it. And one guy just said they can lead you through the river, but you still have to launch the boat. That's how he said it. You still have to do a thing. They can bring you toward the plate, but then you need to do this other thing. And then sometimes it happens often. We'll be at a kind of conversational level in the first 5 to 7 minutes, and then we get to an emotionally charged part of the story about remembering getting
Hmm.
shot or drowning or something. The most of the people that I deal with have been through a trauma. And when they get to the trauma, they'll say, I used to cry every time I tried to tell this story, and I don't need to do that anymore, but it still chokes me up. And then they'll say, let's pause for a minute, and then we need to connect. And sometimes they use metaphors like screwing in a light bulb or having a wire that's connecting partly, but you need to jiggle it somehow. Uh, or like when we used to listen to AM and FM radio stations in the car, you're getting too far from the signal, but if you twist the knob just a little bit, it comes in a little stronger. There'll be something like that that we need to do in order for us to go to a deeper level of conversation than we were at before.
And you remind me of, sometimes when I tell this story about Mary Fran and Nolan, I, I get, there's a point where, I can be choked up. And I think it's important for people to understand that it's, yes, part of it is sad, extremely so. And, for a long time, I was just bereft. But it's also because I'm in that space again, and the space is so extraordinary. I mean, the the loving grace that is the universe, um, you just can't help but choke up, and
Yeah.
so there's this odd mixture of grief and joy that
Yes.
are even interwoven together, and I find that with people who tells their near death or shared death experiences that it's it's a it's more complicated than just one or the other. That there's a recognition that there's a human side to it and there's a non-physical side to it, a divine side to it, and you get both, and honoring both of those emotions, I think, helps us come to um, a place of understanding about how wonderfully complicated it is to live here in duality.
Yeah. And then try to live here with a unitive consciousness about yourself. I mean, one of the phrases I use are, do you believe that you are a part of everything or apart from everything? And I try to stay in unitive consciousness, otherwise it's just lonely, you know, or other people seem so different and strange and so on. And if I stay there, I get sad and upset. But if I remember that I'm part of you and you're a part of me, that makes it easier.
So there's one thing that pops up in near death experiences that once you know it helps define things, and it's this way: when people leave their physical body and they enter into the world of the non-physical, um, there tends to be they'll enter one of three lights. So there's, we've all seen it on television, the white light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, Harry
Mhm.
Potter had that experience where, they entered into this bright white space that is that's that's love, it's powerful, it's um, and you enter into it such that I've had a couple people tell me that when they're in this white light, um, they were smart enough to look around to see if there was a shadow, and there isn't, because it's you're just in this light, this love of the universe. So there's a white light.
And a
There's
shadow
also
is only created because the lights that we're used to have one source, not many sources.
yeah, or yeah,
Or
omnipresent source, yeah.
yes, exactly.
And the second one is black light. And the black light, go right to Genesis 1, where it talks about how, um, you know, before there was form, there was the void.
Yes.
And in that's the void that some people will go right straight to source. Before there was anything, there was just God hanging out in the void.
Mhm.
And it's an incredibly loving, joyous unity experience. So that's black light. And what happened to me was the clear light experience. And this is, if we were having that experience right now, all of a sudden I would see that this desk is glowing, full of energy, and the microphone and the books and the book stand. Everything is made up of this light that is the love of the universe. And you begin to realize that everything is made up of the same stuff.
You are the light of the world. That's one of the ways that Jesus put it.
Yep. And that's a clear light experience. And so what happened to me just sitting there on the windowsill is that all of a sudden I began to be aware that this light is everywhere present. It is me. It's the desk, it's the papers, it's everything. And that kind of knowledge just doesn't leave you,
Of course
that
not.
everything is this love, and we are all just differentiated bits of this vibration. I'm vibrating at a slower energy, and this desk is I'm at is probably even slower still.
Mhm.
But when I go to talk to Mary Fran and Nolan, that's at a higher level.
Yes.
And so it goes to your point, which is a long way around to what you were saying. It's about how can we match our vibrations.
Yes. Even earlier, when you use the phrase physical and non-physical, the people that are out of body have a new physics. And one of the things they need to get used to is how it operates. The way, when we arrived out of the womb, we had capacities to do all kind of things that we couldn't do right away. We didn't know how to stand and walk and talk and uh, we'd put our foot in our mouth and put everything in our mouth. Uh, I've heard, we go back, we help people do this one crossing thing that we do to help them move out of this therapeutic zone to a higher plane, but then we don't tell their stories without asking. And so we do go back one more time, only to ask, not to poke around and disturb their peace, but just to say, Scott, may I please use your story? What do you think? May I tell it out loud? And when we do, we get updates sometimes just because that's what people do. It's been a long time since we've talked. What's been going on? And they'll
Yeah.
give a little update. And sometimes they describe that they were really interested in this body and what it could do and not do. It has all kind of there's things that it can do. You can learn to be in more than one place at a time, which is what bilocation is. I
Yep.
don't think that that's rare after we leave the body. Uh, I think,
Oh,
and in the
and
Catholic world, we when we talk to one of the saints, there might be a thousand other people talking to them at the same time, but they're not overwhelmed. They're able to focus completely on what you're saying to them or asking of them without distraction. Anyway, the physics of the next life is something that, and sometimes there are people that were interested in physics that die. The first thing they want to do is study the physics of the new environment they're in.
so the shorthand for me is that here in the physical world, the duality world,
Yeah.
it's run by the words either or. You know,
Okay.
I'm sitting here and I'm different than this desk, and I'm
Yes.
different than you. You know, that we
Yes.
have this separateness that comes with being in the physical world. We move into the non physical world, and it's run by the words both and, where I can be me, you can be you, and we are also part of this whole that is the loving universe, and we're part of the total human consciousness, which is part of the
Yes.
God consciousness. So the physics are way different,
Yes.
and that just by sitting here going, okay, both and either or, just that helps us to get kind of organized in that way. And what my near death experiencers tell me is that once they realize that, they realize they have a choice. That here in the physical world, we can reach back and pull the rules of the non physical into this space.
Yes.
And ta da,
Thy
because
kingdom
this,
come on earth as it is in heaven. That's one of the ways that the Christian tradition and the Jesus tradition speaks of that.
yep. So they fully realize that and come and embrace it and then say, well, now that I know about this, what can I do with it?
Yeah.
You know, how can I express my loving nature in a way that I couldn't do it before? So
I'm
it's an eye-opening kind of an event to realize that you can choose which set of rules that you want, because this physical world is a really small subset of the non-physical.
right. We're recording this 2 days after the national election, and I'm living in a swing state. So we were one of the lucky seven that got inundated with us and them oriented ads. And Uh, now that part is over with, but the word Catholic means universal, which means one. And I've lived in the United States of America for my whole life, and I just feel like I'm like doubly called to live unitively. And even if the world around me wants to fight itself or retreat into its corners or whatnot, I believe that's really falsehood. It moves against the nature of the universe to be that way. So but I keep having to discipline my own thinking and my own acting to make sure that I'm living on that. It's not that I'm trying to have my head in the clouds. Um, I think my head is already in the clouds before I think we're in the atmosphere. We can't help that. The atmosphere surrounds us. We breathe it, we take it in. But we're capable of being united when we choose consciously to think and act that way. We don't have to be at odds with each other. We can say, no, and we do that on the 4th of July or patriotic circumstances where we focus on the brotherhood of man or the, the high ideals. I don't know. I just think it's so important to not allow ourselves to devolve into only either or, even while we're on this plane.
Yep. I was talking with my wife last night, and we were talking about, well, now how do we live in this new reality? And we've come to exactly the same conclusion as you. It's different words, but it's be the change that you want to see in the world. And I want to live from a unity place
Yes.
where we are in alignment with the loving consciousness that is all of the physical world. And and so yeah, it's important to live from that place and to filter these experiences that we have here in this physical world through that lens,
Yes.
and to say how can I best reflect what I know to be the ultimate truth of the universe, and in so doing be able to affect change in the world by modeling what that might look like. So important, especially now that we are able to be loving beings, um, even when it might be tough.
But I want to give you a few minutes at the end of a podcast to let people know how they can be in touch with you if you're open to that. What are some of the resources that you've made available publicly that people might benefit by? So sound off, Scott.
Sure. Um, there's one place to go that makes it really easy, and that's my website. It's Near Death Meditations, plural, neardeathmeditations.com. And at that website, there are an explanation and some videos about me. There's a link to my YouTube channel, which is now in the top 8% worldwide. Yoo-hoo! We just
Yeah.
crossed that boundary about 2 weeks ago, which is great. Um, I have 4 classes that I have taught on the Shift Network, and they're evergreen, meaning they're
Hmm.
video, and that link is on there. There's links to interviews, and there's links to the uh, albums of guided meditations. So that meditation process that I told you about, it takes advantage of binaural beats, which helps change your vibratory level, so you more easily enter into these um, different expanded states of awareness.
Is that
I,
related to Hemi-Sync?
yes, actually, that's where I learned about it, and it's just Hemi-Sync is about a 50-year-old technology.
Hmm.
And I think they're like on Hemi-Sync 8.0 now.
I see.
And
Okay.
and so I just call it binaural beats because that's the big word. My albums are recorded at using Hemi-Sync, especially blended for me. In fact, you can see the albums behind
Mhm.
my head here, and it's all about. Um, I use the energetic pathway of near death experiences to help people enter into expanded states of awareness. So it's about, meeting your escort and the reunion which you have with the dead relatives, and how we can learn to communicate. And we talked about that earlier, the symbolic nature of communication that happens. Rarely is it in English,
Mhm.
but it comes in the form of symbols and emotions and intuition. And anyway, so we teach all that stuff,
Uh-huh.
and it just makes tooling around the non-physical universe a little quicker and more understandable. So wrapping this up, neardeathmeditations.com. From that one place, um, poof, there's all these things that I'm doing, and there's a spot there you can email me.
Okay.
Ta-da.
All right. Perfect.
Perfect.
All right.
So thank you for putting that on the notes
Sure.
for the podcast. I appreciate that.
Sure. Well, that's important. And I get a lot of email through my podcast and being guests on ones like yours, and people bring all kind of questions, and a lot of them are heartbreaking. You know, they're people that are grieving and mourning or lost and so on, and any tools that we can put in front of them that might give them some peace and some knowledge and positive experiences is so
And I'm
important.
so grateful. There are so many resources now, yours, mine, that are are there for people who are grieving and don't understand what has happened and where we're going and what we're
Right, and a
doing.
lot of things that we both do are open source. You know, they're you don't have to buy everything. A lot of things are just there to view and experience. And then if you want to go deeper, you know, the stuff that we
Yeah.
recordings and books are not very expensive. If you want to go
There's
deep,
only 3,000, near death experience stories on the internet. So,
exactly,
have at it.
exactly, yeah, yeah, have some fun. All right. Well, it's been great being with you, Scott. I hope we can do this again or see each other in some future place. I imagine. Will you be at Ions again? And our next meeting is in Chicago in August.
I'll be co-MC again,
Yeah.
and we're gonna have fun. That was actually my very first IANS conference was in Chicago. Got a lot of family there. Um, so I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing you
Yeah.
again,
I've
Father
circled it
Nathan.
on my calendar. I'll certainly be there.
And thank you for the invitation to come. I really had fun today. So this has been just great.
Well, terrific. Well, I'm grateful that you spent the time with us. So thanks so much. So that wraps this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm so glad that you could be with us. Remember that if there's something I can do to be of help, you can contact me through my website, which is nathan-castle.com. And remember that I'm praying for you. Uh, I'm a contemplative, semi-contemplative friar, and part of what I do each day is just pray for whatever is on the heart of people that pay attention to this podcast. So, with that, adios. See you next time. Bye bye. And we're done.
Yahoo!
Okay. Well, that was a little longer than many, but we had a lot to
We
talk
we
about.
kind of lost track there. Just
Oh, well, if there's anything that you'd like to shape in it, you can tell me now because Chantel will see it. She'll see this right at the end. And is there anything that you felt like uh,
I am perfectly in good shape. I thought we had a fascinating conversation, and it's so nice to be able to do that little compare and contrast thing from your experience to mine to our resources. Anyway, I
I
really
haven't
like it.
gotten to do any. I took one class with Jimmy. Do you know Jimmy Aiken?
I do not.
He's a big deal in my world. He belongs to or has worked for 30 years with an organization called Catholic Answers out of San Diego, and they're Catholic Christian apologists. So it's kind of a lawyerly take on the tradition and
Hmm.
what catechism says about a question, and not just the catechism, but papal documents through history or scripture and how scripture's been interpreted on a particular question through history. Anyway, it takes a very lawyerly frame of mind to want to do that. And he invited me on his show because I get critiqued about doing the devil's work, doing occult stuff because I talk to people who have died. And so he had me
Oh
on his
dear.
show. His show is called Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. And he's this odd combination of this Catholic apologist that tend to skew very conservative, and then he also calls himself a paranormal investigator. And
Wow.
yeah, so he teaches at the is it called the Rhine Institute?
Oh, sure. I
Yeah,
know them. They're in the same building as the Ions in Durham.
in Durham. Okay. Well, I just took a course with him that was Christianity and it's like Christianity and Parapsychology 101. How do they line up? Uh, the parapsychological tradition is only what about maybe 120 years old, maybe Middle of
Yeah.
the middle of the 18, like Lincoln and people like that were having seances and so on. So there were from about the middle of the 19th century forward, there's that becomes a tradition. And so
Yeah. And then what, probably 50 years ago, it flips. I mean, that was kind of an experiential tradition.
yeah.
And then the Rhine-ish people got involved. Yeah, about 50 years ago to the scientific side. Ions, it's a birth there.
Yeah, and
And
then you had Edgar Casey somewhere in the mix and all of that. Um, uh, well, anyway, I am ignorant of a lot of things in that realm, but I think that might be a growth edge in my life coming down the pike.
so is he in the Jesuit tradition? I mean, all
He's
my
a
brother.
layman. In fact, his some of his life story parallels yours. He was the love of his life. He was married for maybe a year or two to his wife when she died at about age 27. And that sent him into a search for uh, metaphysical meaning and
Yeah.
afterlife stuff and all of that. And he never married and no children, but he has that as kind of a creation story, or at least
Yeah.
a bellwether moment in his life that sent him in a different direction. He vouches for me. He stood up for me, and he Catholic critics that want to say that what I'm doing is evil. He can say, well, here's why you might be inclined to think that, but in fact, here's why that's not so. And he can slice and dice it in a way that,
Interesting. So when I'm doing my doctoral work, this is 2000 and 2001 in there. Part of what I did was to take my research and go to churches and just talk about what it is that I'm seeing and getting feedback
mhm.
on other other people's perspectives. And I would tell you 75% of the churches that invited me were Catholics.
Oh yeah.
And um, and so clearly the mystical tradition, at least in the Minneapolis St. Paul area, um, is still alive and well. It might be a little underground, but boy, we had some really interesting conversations.
Well, I'm trying to be more in that world, and Jimmy is helping me because a lot of people pay attention to what he has to say. He's a very big influencer, and
Mm.
it's only been about a year that he endorsed me, and now I'm beginning to get invitations from places that would have thought I was too uh, radical or something to deal with. Anyway,
Well, congratulations.
thank you, thank you. All right, well, I don't know exactly when this will air, but I'll have Chantel, my assistant, be in touch with you to let you know that, and then then it can post to every place that you put such things.
It's true. Poof. There's wonderful technology that's out there now where you post it to YouTube and then boom, it goes.
Yeah, and
Well,
I got it through all my education on a typewriter, and here I am podcasting from my desk. It's a wonderful thing.
it's a wonderful thing. And thank goodness. Thank
Yeah,
goodness you're there doing the work that you do and letting people know that we are more than our physical bodies.
absolutely, and it's right under your nose. If
It's right here, right here, right now.
right.
No place to go.
All right,
Boom.
all right,
Adios. Have
all
a
right.
wonderful afternoon.
Until next time, you too. Bye bye.
Bye. Mwah. Big hug.
Well.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.